It was the summer of 1944. The war in Western Europe had reached a fever pitch. Allied forces had broken out of the Normandy beachhead, and one man above all others was driving the advance like a force of nature, General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army. He moved fast, thought faster, and struck with a violence that left German commanders scrambling to respond. In Berlin, the situation was being watched with growing alarm. Patton's Third Army was not simply advancing. It was tearing through German defensive lines like they were made of paper, covering ground in days that should have taken weeks, bypassing strong points, cutting off entire units, and threatening to collapse the entire German position in France before winter arrived. The German High Command needed to stop him. And so they made a decision that looked powerful on paper and proved catastrophic in practice. They would send the Tigers. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger I was the most feared tank in the world, a 60-ton fortress of steel and firepower that had terrorized Allied forces from North Africa to the Eastern Front. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where the Allied tanks could not even scratch it. 92 Tiger tanks were committed to stopping Patton's advance. They were crewed by experienced men, supported by infantry and artillery, and sent into battle with the full confidence of commanders who believed that numbers and firepower would be enough. It was not enough. What happened next became one of the most decisive armored engagements of the entire Second World War, and a masterclass in why tactical superiority means nothing when operational genius is working against you. To understand what happened to those 92 Tiger tanks, you first have to understand what the Tiger was and what it was believed to be capable of. The Tiger I entered service with the German Army in 1942, and from its very first engagements it created a fear in Allied soldiers that went far beyond the normal dread of enemy armor. It was not merely a tank. It was a psychological weapon. The numbers were staggering for the time. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick, more than twice the protection offered by the American M4 Sherman. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun that had already proven itself across multiple theaters, could penetrate the armor of virtually any Allied tank at combat ranges. There were documented cases of Tigers destroying Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, essentially from so far away that the Sherman crews had almost no warning before the hit. In the narrow bocage country of Normandy and the forested terrain of the Ardennes, the Tiger's limitations, its poor speed, its mechanical unreliability, its enormous fuel consumption, were somewhat offset by the defensive terrain. But Patton was not fighting in bocage. He was driving through open France at a pace that turned the Tiger's weaknesses into fatal vulnerabilities. The Tiger needed time to set up defensive positions. It needed reliable supply lines to feed its insatiable appetite for fuel. It needed terrain that channeled attackers toward its guns. Patton's method of warfare denied it all three. The Tigers were sent to stop a storm, armed with weapons designed for a completely different kind of fight. If the Tiger was the most feared weapon the Germans could send against him, Patton was the most feared commander the Americans could send against them. His reputation preceded him into every engagement, not just among his own troops, who both feared and worshipped him, but among the German commanders who faced him and came to regard his presence on any front as the single most reliable indicator that their situation was about to become dramatically worse. Patton had been studied by German intelligence. They had files on him, analysis of his previous campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, assessments of his methods and his psychology. What those files could not fully capture was the quality that made him genuinely dangerous: he understood time as a weapon. In Patton's philosophy of warfare, speed was not simply desirable. It was the decisive factor. An enemy that could not react, could not resupply, could not concentrate its forces, could not move its reserves, that enemy was already beaten, regardless of what equipment it possessed. He had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with an almost instinctive depth that few commanders on either side possessed. He understood what the Germans called Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, the principle of giving subordinates objectives rather than orders and trusting them to find the best way to achieve those objectives. His corps and division commanders knew what he wanted: forward, always forward, never give the enemy time to breathe. When the 92 Tigers were committed against his advance, Patton did not stop to worry about their armor thickness or their gun range. He asked one question: where are their supply lines? The answer to that question would determine everything that followed. The story of how Patton came to face those 92 Tigers begins with Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July 1944. For weeks after D-Day, the Allied advance had been grinding and costly, trapped in the hedgerow country of Normandy where German defenders used every ditch, wall, and tree line to slow the advance. The liberation of France seemed to be measuring itself in yards. Operation Cobra changed everything. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive offensive preceded by one of the largest carpet bombing operations in history. When the bombs stopped falling and the dust settled, a gap had been torn in the German lines wide enough for armored forces to pour through. General Omar Bradley ordered the exploitation, and the man he chose to lead it was Patton, whose Third Army was officially activated on August 1. Within days, the nature of the campaign had transformed completely. German units that had been fighting coherently from prepared positions were suddenly finding themselves flanked, cut off, and destroyed piecemeal as Patton's armored columns raced through the gap and fanned out across France. The pace of the advance was almost impossible to believe. Third Army covered more ground in its first week than Allied forces had covered in the entire previous 2 months. The Germans were reeling. Their command structure, already strained by Hitler's constant interference and the catastrophic losses of the Normandy fighting, was struggling to respond to an enemy that was not moving the way enemies were supposed to move. Patton was not following the roads the German planners had identified as the logical axes of advance. He was going everywhere, all at once, and the Tigers sat in assembly areas waiting for a front that kept moving before they could reach it. While the Tiger tanks were being positioned to stop Patton's advance, the larger German situation in France was collapsing into one of the war's most complete disasters. The Falaise Pocket, the encirclement of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army between American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north, was consuming the best remaining German units in the west. By mid-August 1944, approximately 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking pocket near the town of Falaise in Normandy. Allied aircraft hunted anything that moved on the roads inside the pocket. The destruction was on a scale that shocked even experienced war correspondents. General Eisenhower, who visited the battlefield after it was over, described a scene of devastation unlike anything he had seen in any theater of the war. The Falaise Pocket devoured German armored reserves that might otherwise have supported the Tiger units being sent against Patton. Panzer divisions that existed on paper as the backbone of German resistance in France were reduced to remnants, a handful of tanks, a few hundred exhausted men, no fuel, no ammunition, no coherent command. The German army in France was not simply losing. It was disintegrating. Into this chaos, the order went out to deploy the Tigers. The logic, from the German High Command's perspective, was that a concentrated force of heavy armor could still create a defensive line strong enough to slow the Allied advance and buy time for a new defensive position to be organized east of Paris. The logic was not unreasonable in isolation. In the actual context of what was happening on the ground, it was a death warrant for the men and machines involved. George Patton understood something about armored warfare that was not universally grasped by commanders of his era. The tank battle is often decided by what happens 20 miles behind the front lines, not at the point of contact. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, the unglamorous machinery of military logistics, determined who could fight and for how long more reliably than any calculation of firepower and armor. Patton's staff was fanatical about supply. His quartermaster officers operated under the same aggressive philosophy as his combat commanders: find a way, improvise if necessary, but keep the tanks moving. When official supply channels could not keep up with the pace of the advance, Patton's people created unofficial ones. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that ran day and night to carry supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing Third Army, was in large part a response to the demands Patton placed on the supply system. The Tiger tanks facing him operated in a completely different logistical reality. Each Tiger consumed enormous quantities of fuel, approximately 8 gallons per mile cross-country, compared to roughly 1 gallon per mile for the Sherman. In a situation where German fuel supplies were already critically strained by Allied bombing of refineries and the chaos of the retreat, moving 92 Tigers any significant distance required a logistical effort that the German Army of August 1944 was barely capable of sustaining. Several Tiger units arrived at their intended deployment positions with tanks that had consumed most of their available fuel during the approach march. They were positioned, hull down in defensive positions, unable to maneuver, waiting for resupply that was fighting its way through roads already under Allied air attack. The battle had already begun to go wrong before a single gun was fired. No account of what happened to those 92 Tigers can be told without confronting the role of Allied air power. By the summer of 1944, the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force had established a dominance over the battlefield that made large-scale daylight movement of German armored forces extraordinarily dangerous. Fighter bombers, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolt, which proved to be a devastatingly effective ground attack aircraft, prowled the roads and rail lines of France with near impunity. The Tiger, for all its armor, was vulnerable from above. Its roof armor was thin compared to its frontal protection. A well-placed bomb or rocket strike on the engine deck could destroy a Tiger as completely as any tank gun. And the fighter-bomber pilots had become expert at finding German armor, even when it tried to move at night or shelter under tree cover during the day. The Tiger units moving toward their deployment positions were hunted from the moment they began to move. The roads leading to the front were littered with the burned-out hulks of vehicles of every type, tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, artillery pieces, all destroyed by Allied air attack. German columns moved in constant fear of the distinctive silhouette of the P-47 appearing over a tree line, and that fear was entirely rational. The psychological effect of constant air attack, beyond the physical destruction it caused, degraded the combat effectiveness of German units in ways that are difficult to quantify but were universally reported. Several Tiger tanks were destroyed or immobilized by air attack before they ever came within range of an American tank gun. Others broke down under the mechanical stress of forced marches on deteriorating roads. The 92 Tigers were already fewer than 92 by the time the real fighting began. The tactical matchup between the Tiger and the Sherman was, in terms of individual vehicle specifications, embarrassingly one-sided in the Tiger's favor. This was not a secret to anyone involved. American tank crews knew they were climbing into machines that could be killed by the Tiger at ranges where they could not return the favor. The psychological burden of that knowledge was real and heavy. And yet the Sherman won. Not in every individual engagement, there were ambushes and defensive actions where Tigers destroyed Shermans at terrible ratios, sometimes 10 or 12 to 1 before being knocked out or abandoned. But at the operational level, in the campaign that mattered, the Sherman's combination of reliability, fuel efficiency, ease of maintenance, and above all, sheer numbers, proved decisive. When a Tiger broke down, and Tigers broke down constantly, their complex suspension and transmission systems requiring maintenance that was difficult to provide in the field, it was frequently abandoned because German recovery vehicles were overwhelmed and fuel for recovery operations was unavailable. When a Sherman broke down, American mechanics fixed it, often within hours, and it was back in the line. Patton understood this asymmetry intuitively. He did not need to defeat Tigers in straight-up tank duels. He needed to keep moving, keep the Germans reacting, keep the pressure constant, and let the Tiger's own mechanical fragility and fuel consumption do his work for him. Every Tiger that broke down on a forced march was a Tiger that would never point its gun at an American tank. Patton intended to create the conditions for exactly that outcome, and he succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Among the engagements that defined the fate of the Tiger force sent against Patton, several stand out with particular clarity. One of the most brutal occurred near a small French town whose name most people have never heard, in a battle that lasted less than 3 days and consumed a Tiger battalion almost completely. The German commander had positioned his Tigers on the high ground east of the town, hull down behind the ridge line, their guns covering the main road that his intelligence assessment said Patton's columns would use. It was a sound tactical decision. The position offered excellent fields of fire, protection from frontal attack, and a withdrawal route to the east if things went wrong. In the War of 1943, it might have worked. Patton did not come down the main road. His lead elements probed the position, identified it, and reported back. Within hours, Patton's response was characteristically indirect. Two armored columns swung wide around both flanks of the Tiger position simultaneously, moving cross-country at speeds that the German commander had not believed possible. By the time the flanking forces were in position, the Tigers on the ridge were no longer looking at an enemy in front of them. They were surrounded. The Tigers could not maneuver. Their fuel situation made a breakout attempt to gamble that the German commander was not authorized to take without orders, and orders from higher command were slow to arrive because Patton's advance had already disrupted the communications network that connected the Tiger Battalion to its parent headquarters. By the time the order came to break out, the window had closed. American infantry with tank support pressed in from three directions, and the battle ended in the destruction of the battalion. One of the most striking aspects of what happened to the 92 Tiger tanks is how many of them were lost without ever engaging American armor in a direct firefight. The causes were mundane and unglamorous: mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, air attack, and the simple impossibility of operating heavy armor in conditions that had fundamentally changed while the Tigers were in transit to the front. The Tiger's suspension system, the famous interleaved road wheels that gave it a smoother ride than most tanks of the era, was one of the most complex and maintenance-intensive in the German arsenal. In winter conditions, mud and ice could freeze between the wheels overnight, immobilizing a tank that had been operational the evening before. In the summer conditions of France in 1944, the problem was different but equally serious. The wheels and their associated bearings accumulated dust and grit at a rate that demanded constant cleaning, and cleaning was something that exhausted crews operating under constant air attack and relentless pressure had very little time to perform. Several Tigers were found by advancing American forces simply sitting at the side of roads, abandoned when their engines seized or their transmissions failed. Some still had ammunition. Some still had partial fuel loads. They were mechanically dead, and their crews had either been killed by air attack, captured, or had walked away into the retreating mass of the German army. American recovery teams, tasked with examining captured German equipment, reported finding Tiger after Tiger in this condition, intact externally, often with personal belongings of the crew still inside, abandoned not to superior firepower but to the grinding reality that the German army could no longer maintain its most complex weapons in the field. What made Patton's campaign against the Tiger force so devastating was not any single tactical decision. It was the relentlessness of the operational tempo he imposed on the entire German defensive effort. Patton did not believe in pauses. He did not believe in consolidation. He believed in pursuit, and he pursued with an intensity that denied the German army the one thing it needed most: time. Time to repair broken Tigers. Time to move fuel forward. Time to reorganize shattered units. Time to establish coherent defensive lines. Time for commanders to understand what was happening and develop effective responses. Patton took all of it away, not by being at every point at once, but by moving so fast that the German response was always aimed at where he had been, not where he was. His standing orders to his corps commanders were almost childishly simple in their expression but extraordinarily demanding in their execution: find a soft spot, push through it, and do not stop until you run out of fuel or ammunition, and then call me and I will find you more. The result was an advance that resembled a flood more than a conventional military movement, pouring through every gap, around every obstacle, threatening every German position from multiple directions simultaneously. German Tiger crews who had been trained to fight a defensive battle, to select a position, prepare it, and wait for the enemy to come to them, found themselves in a situation where the enemy was already behind them before they had finished preparing their position in front. The psychological effect of this was profound. Men who had fought with confidence in a tank they knew to be nearly invulnerable to frontal attack began to feel that the invulnerability was irrelevant when the threat came from every direction at once. If there was a single technical factor that more than any other determined the fate of the Tiger force committed against Patton, it was fuel. The Tiger's thirst for gasoline was legendary within the German army, both as a logistical challenge and as the subject of dark humor among the men who drove them. At full combat load, a Tiger carried enough fuel for approximately 85 miles of road travel, and considerably less across country. In August 1944, the German army in France was operating on fuel reserves that were, by any objective measure, inadequate for major armored operations. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants had reduced production to a fraction of wartime requirements. The chaos of the retreat from Normandy had disrupted the distribution network that moved fuel from rear areas to forward units. And every fuel convoy that tried to move by daylight was hunted by Allied fighter bombers that treated road traffic as a primary target. The result was a situation where Tiger units received fuel allocations that amounted to a fraction of what their operational plans required. Commanders who had planned maneuver warfare found themselves reduced to static defense simply because they did not have enough fuel to move. When Patton's flanking columns appeared on roads that the Tiger's fuel state made it impossible to block, there was no operational response available. The Tigers sat and waited and hoped that American infantry would come in from the front, which Patton, understanding exactly this dynamic, was careful not to do. Several complete Tiger companies were captured or destroyed because they had been ordered to hold positions they could no longer leave under their own power. They had been turned, by their own logistical situation, from mobile armored assets into fixed defensive positions, and fixed positions, as Patton had always understood, exist only to be bypassed and isolated. The Tiger was not designed to fight alone. In German tactical doctrine, Tiger units were supposed to operate as the armored fist of a combined arms team, supported by infantry that protected them from close-range attack, by artillery that suppressed enemy anti-tank weapons, by engineers that cleared obstacles, and by reconnaissance that found the enemy before the Tigers drove into an ambush. The Tiger in isolation, for all its firepower and armor, was vulnerable in ways that its specifications did not reveal. In August 1944, that combined arms support had largely ceased to exist. The infantry divisions that should have accompanied the Tigers were themselves shattered remnants of units that had been through 2 months of grinding combat in Normandy. Many had lost more than half their strength. Their survivors were exhausted, their equipment depleted, their leadership decimated by the kind of attrition that had consumed German junior officer cadres across every front since Stalingrad. When Tiger units were positioned to fight, they often found themselves with minimal infantry support, sometimes a company of exhausted soldiers who had been marching for days, sometimes nothing at all. The anti-tank guns that should have protected their flanks had been lost or lacked transport. The artillery that should have provided fire support was short of ammunition and frequently being engaged by American counter-battery fire. American tank crews and infantry commanders quickly learned to probe Tiger positions to find the infantry gaps. Where there was no German infantry, American soldiers could work close enough to Tigers to use bazookas, grenades, or simply to call in artillery and air support on a fixed target. The Tigers that survived longest were those whose commanders scrounged whatever infantry support they could find and used it aggressively. The Tigers that died first were those sitting alone in positions that American infantry simply walked around and attacked from behind. Part 14, The Bridge at Argentan. One of the most consequential episodes in the campaign against the Tiger force was the fight for control of key crossing points over the rivers that bisected northern France. The Seine, the Loire, the Moselle, these natural obstacles offered the retreating German army its best chances to establish temporary defensive lines, and the Tiger units were frequently positioned to hold the bridges long enough for the main body of German troops to cross and then destroy the bridges behind them. The bridge at Argentan became a focal point of one of the most intense engagements of the entire campaign. German Tiger tanks had been positioned on the east bank to cover the crossing of retreating units, their guns controlling the approaches to the bridge with the kind of firepower that made a direct frontal assault almost suicidal. American commanders who assessed the position honestly recommended against a direct attack. Patton did not authorize a direct attack. He authorized a crossing 3 miles upstream, where engineer units had located a ford, and a simultaneous feint in force at the bridge itself to keep the Tiger crews focused on the threat in front of them. By the time the flanking force had crossed the river and was moving on the Tiger position from the rear, the German commander had committed the mistake of remaining focused on the threat that was never going to be the main effort. The Tigers at Argentan were destroyed from behind, the worst possible direction from which to be engaged, where their armor was thinnest and their crews had the least warning. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, American engineers crossed the bridge unmolested and the advance continued. One dimension of the defeat of the Tiger Force that was not known to the public until decades after the war was the role of ultra-intelligence, the British program that had broken the German Enigma cipher and was providing Allied commanders with a window into German military communications at the highest levels. Patton, through his G2 intelligence staff, received processed ultra material that gave him a picture of German intentions and dispositions that his opposite numbers could not have imagined he possessed. When the orders deploying the Tiger Force against his advance were transmitted through German signal channels, those transmissions were intercepted, decrypted, and summarized for Allied commanders within hours. Patton knew, in broad terms, where the Tigers were being sent, what routes they were taking, and what defensive positions they were intended to occupy. He could not share this knowledge with his subordinates without risking compromise of the ultra-secret, but he could shape his operational decisions around it. Several of the flank attacks that destroyed Tiger units in detail, operations that seemed, to the German commanders, to demonstrate an almost supernatural awareness of German intentions, were in fact informed by ultra-intelligence that told Patton's staff where the Tigers were going before they got there. Roads were interdicted by air attack. Flanking routes were secured before Tiger units arrived to block them. Positions that Tiger commanders believed they had prepared in time were already being enveloped by the time the Tigers reached them. Ultra did not win the campaign by itself. It never did. But it gave Patton an advantage that amplified his already formidable operational instincts, turning good decisions into perfect ones and transforming the defeat of the Tiger Force from a possible outcome into an almost mathematically inevitable one. It would be a distortion of history to tell this story purely as a triumph of American operational art without acknowledging what it cost the men inside those Tiger tanks. German Tiger crews were, by almost every account, among the most skilled and dedicated armored soldiers in any army of the war. They had been trained rigorously, selected carefully, and had in many cases been fighting for years before they climbed into the tanks that would carry them to their deaths in France in 1944. They understood, many of them, that the situation was hopeless. Veterans could read a campaign the way a doctor reads symptoms. The signs of a dying operation were visible to anyone with enough experience to interpret them. The fuel shortages, the absent infantry support, the constant air attack, the communications failures, the orders that arrived too late or not at all, these men had seen enough of the war to know what these things meant. And yet they fought. Some fought with extraordinary effectiveness even in impossible circumstances, destroying American armor and holding positions far longer than any rational assessment of the situation would have suggested was possible. They were not fighting for Hitler or for the ideology of the regime. By 1944, most German soldiers at the sharp end had long since reduced their motivation to something simpler and more human: the man beside them, the obligation not to abandon the infantry they were supporting, the professional pride of the trained soldier who does the job even when the job has become the doing of it. The Tiger crews who died in France in the summer of 1944 deserve to be remembered as human beings in an impossible situation, sent by an institution that had already failed them, into a battle that their own commanders privately believed could not be won. The Battle of Avranches in early August 1944 was, in many ways, the moment that determined the fate of the entire Tiger Force. Hitler, characteristically, had intervened in the operational situation with a counterattack order that defied military logic but had the authority of the supreme commander behind it. German armored forces, including several of the Tiger units earmarked for the defensive mission against Patton, were instead ordered to counterattack westward toward Avranches, with the objective of cutting Patton's supply lines at their base. The counterattack, Operation Luttich, launched on August 7, was a disaster within hours of its beginning. German armored columns moving by daylight were savaged by Allied air power. Tiger tanks that had survived the approach to their assault positions were destroyed in the attack or during the withdrawal that followed. The operation consumed irreplaceable German armored strength without achieving any of its objectives, and it exposed the flanks of the German forces in France to the very encirclement that would produce the Falaise pocket. For the Tigers that had been intended as the defensive stop against Patton, Luttich was catastrophic. Units that should have been conserving their fuel and positioning for a coherent defense were instead committed to an offensive that drained their strength, disrupted their logistics, and positioned them in exactly the wrong place when the American flanking movements began to close around the German forces in Normandy. Patton's reaction to Luttich was to accelerate. While German armor was attacking west toward Avranches, his forces were swinging south and east, extending the encirclement. The Tigers that survived Luttich found themselves inside the developing Falaise pocket, facing not a defensive battle on ground of their choosing but a desperate breakout attempt from a closing trap. When the dust settled and Allied intelligence teams began moving through the battlefields of northern France cataloging destroyed and abandoned German equipment, the count of Tiger tanks was grim reading for anyone who had authorized their deployment. Of the 92 Tiger tanks committed against Patton's advance, fewer than 5 were confirmed to have escaped the campaign in operational condition. The breakdown of losses was itself instructive. Fewer than a third had been destroyed by American tank gun fire in direct combat engagements. The rest had been lost to air attack, to mechanical breakdown and subsequent abandonment, to fuel exhaustion, to the encirclement at Falaise, and to the chaos of the retreat. The Tigers' invulnerability in a straight-up tank fight had been essentially irrelevant to the outcome, because Patton had refused to fight the kind of battle in which that invulnerability would have been decisive. This ratio, the majority of losses coming not from direct combat but from the operational conditions that Patton had created, told a story that Allied planners absorbed carefully. Modern warfare was not primarily won by the tank that could kill the most other tanks. It was won by the campaign that destroyed the enemy's ability to fight, maintain, supply, and maneuver his forces. A Tiger stranded without fuel in a ditch was exactly as combat ineffective as a Tiger with a shell through its turret. The 92 Tigers had been Germany's best available answer to Patton's advance. That answer had proven completely inadequate, not primarily because American technology was superior, but because American operational thinking was superior. The lesson would be studied in every serious military academy for the rest of the century. George Patton was not a modest man, and he was not inclined to understate what he had accomplished. But in his private writings, his diary, his letters to his wife, the operational notes he kept throughout the campaign, there are passages that reveal a genuinely sophisticated understanding of why his campaign had succeeded against the Tiger force, beyond a simple narrative of American skill defeating German steel. He wrote, in one memorable passage, that the enemy's tanks were irrelevant when you owned the road net behind them. He understood, with complete clarity, that the Tiger's battlefield dominance was conditional. It depended on a set of circumstances that he had made it his business to prevent from occurring. Position, supply, infantry support, time to prepare, the Tiger needed all of these things to fight effectively, and Patton's operational method was specifically designed to deny every one of them. He also wrote with respect for the German soldiers he faced, not the leadership, which he regarded with contempt by this point in the war, but the men in the tanks and foxholes. He recognized that many of them were fighting with extraordinary skill and courage in a situation that their own leadership had made untenable, and that the defeat of the Tiger force was not a demonstration that German soldiers were inferior. It was a demonstration that German strategy and operational art had failed completely. Patton's genius was not the genius of the tactician who wins individual engagements. It was the genius of the operational artist who designs campaigns so that individual engagements, when they occur, are already decided. By the time American crews and Tiger crews were actually shooting at each other, Patton had already won. The shooting was just the confirmation of a decision made miles and days away from the point of contact. Part 20, Legacy, What the Tiger's Defeat Tells US About War. The destruction of those 92 Tiger tanks in the summer of 1944 is not simply a story about one campaign in one war. It is a case study in principles that have governed warfare across all of recorded history and that remain as relevant today as they were when Patton's columns were racing through the French countryside. The first principle is that tactical superiority is not the same as operational effectiveness. The Tiger was tactically superior to everything the Americans had in almost every direct measure of tank performance. It was destroyed anyway, because the campaign it was deployed in did not allow its tactical superiority to be expressed. A weapon that cannot be fueled, cannot be supported, cannot maneuver, and cannot communicate with its higher command is a weapon that has been operationally neutralized regardless of its technical specifications. The second principle is that speed is a force multiplier that cannot be replicated by firepower alone. Patton moved faster than German commanders could think. He presented threats in multiple places simultaneously. He made every German defensive position provisional by appearing on roads that the position had not been designed to cover. The Tiger, which had been built for a war of deliberate positions and set-piece engagements, had no answer to an opponent who refused to fight that war. The third principle is the most enduring: the side that controls the tempo of a campaign controls its outcome. Patton never gave the Tigers time. Time to set up, time to refuel, time to receive orders, time to understand what was happening. Without time, even the most powerful weapon in a nation's arsenal becomes an expensive piece of immobile steel. The men inside those Tigers deserved better from the commanders who sent them. History did not give them better. It gave them Patton, and in the summer of 1944, Patton was more than enough.